Hello there, Golden Bears. How are we today? I just hope that you're keeping it classy as always. Hey, just a little brief overview of this chapter. There's a lot of themes working in this chapter, and I can really tell that the textbook publisher tried to weave in technology and cultural understanding and kind of the idea of race and all of this in this one little swath. And so as you go through it, probably don't be alarmed if it just doesn't make sense of sorts, but I'm going to do my best part. Here's what I guess as I would describe it to you. Post-World War II, America, as you can know, has grown up big time. We are now one of the leaders of the world at that time, Russia and America. And as so, it's like we have grown from an infant prior to 1776 to where now we are almost becoming the boss of the entire company, if you will. And what is interesting is, let's just take, for instance, Zuckerberg and Facebook. They pride themselves on all their workers coming into there. They would just come in their casual shorts or their tennis shoes and their Vans, and they would just sit there and throw the football around and kind of had a free-for-all on how they worked. Well, now if you're to meet Zuckerberg, he wears a suit and tie and he's matured. This is kind of the illustration as to what America has gone, a freewheeling kind of casual workplace and mindset prior to World War II, but to where now, hey, it's all business and we're bringing a briefcase, and America is going to transition into becoming a relatively strong powerhouse economically. And what does that mean for the American people? I love this quote by William Levitt. We're going to talk a little bit about him towards the end of this lecture, but he says, "No man who owns his own house and lot can be a communist. He has too much to do." I love this double entendre, because communism essentially is you can't have your own private land. That's privateering is complete antithesis of what they believe to. But the second thing is, because if you're a capitalist, you're busy always trying to find a way to improve and to create new opportunities and to find ways to maybe invent something new so you can capture and capitalize on some money. Whereas a communist, hey, they get paid the same regardless if they breathe or don't breathe. And so this was kind of meant to be a double entendre, so to speak. So we'll learn more about William Levitt and what this means going on. This is your graphic organizer for chapter 8.3 that you're going to want to take a look at to kind of see how all three of these things are moving in this particular chapter, all dealing with consumerism and how America is going to go into a major growth point, a growth bubble post-World War II. A couple of things that we're going to talk about is how America faces these economic challenges at the end of the war, and we become stronger as a result of this. Another thing is we're going to talk about how Mommy and Poppy begin having babies for various reasons, and then we're going to talk about how Americans leave the city and move into the suburbs. And that leads me kind of to a story that I would like to share. As you all know, growing up in H-Town, and very few minorities growing up there, mostly Hispanic, a few African American, and it was just a very protected, insular type of experience for us. What we saw on television is the greatest degree of what we had to interpret what other minority groups might have been like. And what was interesting is our high school did a ambassador program where we would load up 2 full school bus loads of students. And I went one year, I think because I was on ASB, and we went to downtown Watts to a high school there. I forget the name of it. I don't know if it was Watts High School or what. And Watts, we'll learn more about Watts, but they've had their share of difficulties, especially race riots and economic riots in the mid-60s. They had stuff in the 1990s. Again, in 2007 and 2008, they've had some concerns and issues. And I'm not saying those things weren't appropriate or were misdirected. I'm just stating that we all felt like, man, we were going into a war zone, so to speak. And we're like, dang, we're going all the way to LA. Well, when we got there, it was a trip. There were like rent-a-cops out in front. We had to go through a metal detector. We're like looking at each other, and then we go in and we go into these classrooms, which didn't seem out of the ordinary. And they had conversations there that I thought were kind of cool. They started discussing issues of apartheid and race and income inequality. I'm like going, what is apartheid and what is this stuff? And I'm just sitting there going, dude, we've never had these conversations before in my classes. And it dawned on me, like, we don't have those conversations because we're just a bunch of white people that don't encounter those concerns. And so this ambassadorship, I guess it did open my eyes to another way of how students were experiencing things. And then guess what? Students from that school came out to our place, and they were like, our campus was wide open, clean, had all sorts of garden-like areas and men's gymnasiums, pools, tennis courts. It was, you know, they were like, what country club have I landed in? And this is Hemet. I know I shouldn't say Hemet Country Club, that's a misnomer, but it was a really great school. In fact, our school won an award across the entire nation for some of the things that it had done for its advanced resources at the time. So they came out and we just had conversations of what it's like to go to school and what it takes to be prepared to go to college, and how do we deal with tough parents. And they're probably sitting there going, these guys have no clue what real life is like. And it was there that I saw a difference between growing up in the suburbs of Hemet versus the reality of growing up if we had lived in LA or specific area of Watts. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about how America changes to mirror some of those things that I had experienced myself. Well, let's first talk about some of the economic and political challenges at the end of World War II that President Truman and the Democrats had to try and deal with. First of all, at the end of the war, there were shortages and high prices and tons of business regulations that were still in place because the economy was still focused on gearing up for war, not for creation of things that people needed. I mean, when they came back from work, they're like, from the war, yeah, they wanted toasters, but the factories weren't making toasters, they were making planes, so to speak. And so it took time for the American factory system to change and catch up. But so what did this mean? Well, if you wanted a toaster, you got to go pay triple than what it would normally cost just to get a toaster. And so this made it very tough for people on one hand, but on the other hand is that there were unions that were pressing for their owners to say, look, we need more money in order to have our employees have higher wages so they can have a better quality of life. And so the owners, again, this struggle comes back and forth between the owner and the union of saying, no, we're not going to pay you more. The union people are saying, yes, you should, because we bring value to that. And what had happened is that, they were going to begin threatening to, quit going to work and going on strike. And I'll tell a little bit more of that story probably in the next chapter. And what is interesting, another tension point, is that we see the divorce rate in juvenile delinquency is increasing during this time. You're saying, what do you mean? I mean, most of the shows that I when I was watching television in the mid-70s as a young child, the shows that I was watching were the shows left over from the 50s and 60s. They were syndicated. And so I kind of grew up watching Father Knows Best, Ozzie and Harriet, Leave It to Beaver, these old school shows that kind of had the mother there waiting for the kids when they come home and having dinner ready and yada, yada, yada. I mean, can you imagine Father Knows Best? That essence of that story was that they didn't explain that the husband was divorced and he had a male maid, so to speak, a caretaker that took care of the kids while he went off to go to work. That was kind of like the Hollywood's version of how do you make adjustments when the wife is no longer in the home. That's a lot like today, or in 2021, a Modern Family, that TV show that has a gay couple living together. You have older couple living together. You have young family, and they're all trying to figure out what that means. What does the nuclear family look like? And we see after the war, various reasons happen. Why does the divorce rate go up? Well, simply put, because the husbands are out fighting, the wives have entered the workplace to replace the factory workers, a lot of different encounters between different sexes, maybe they have different interests. Well, by the time the soldier comes home, maybe the wife has something else in mind, or the other way around, and this increases the divorce rate. We have then also juveniles beginning to kind of have a lot of free time, and they're no longer kind of worried about the war and Nazi Germany and the Japanese. They're just kind of going, well, cool, we got free time on our hands and mom and dad are perhaps making more money. What are we going to do with our time? Well, this idea of teenager emerges and they begin to kind of question and push against the kind of the status quo of that time. Another thing that the government had to do is, how can we help soldiers return and adjust coming back to civilian life? And today, when soldiers come back from various wars, we know about PTSD, but we also know about the Veterans Administration that is there to provide help for them. But back in the day, there was no such thing as PTSD. But the best thing that they did is they did this Servicemen's Readjustment Act. And here you see a little, commercial of that. It is known officially as the GI Bill of Rights, and it is still in existence today, where it essentially is given to every war vet that gives them money to go into college, but it also gives them money and opportunity to help buy their own first home, etc., through the HUD, Housing of Urban Development, that we'll talk about here shortly. But this is an incredible program to give opportunity, the GI Bill, to enable them to get trained in areas that may not otherwise. What did this also do? Enable more people to go into college. Prior to this time, college is only for the relatively wealthy. Now you see a major uptick in people who are saying, well, I got government that's coming to me, money coming from the government for free. Why don't I go to college? Maybe I'll become a teacher. Maybe I'll become a doctor. Maybe I'll become a lawyer. And what does this do? This increases more people going to the middle class. And this was eventually a good thing, obviously, for America. Well, Truman faces this, and he doesn't do that good of a job. Why does Truman have to face this? Well, because FDR dies. And granted, FDR, 4 terms he was elected president, passes away at the age of 63. And now Truman has a lot to face with what is happening there. To continue, they're wondering, the midterm elections are on and the Republicans are frustrated with the Democrats that they're doing nothing to address the out-of-control inflation. They're doing nothing to address when soldiers are coming back. We feel that Truman is really weak on the unions, and the Republicans don't like this fact. And in fact, there's this thing called the Taft-Hartley Act that the Republicans advocated for, which essentially said the unions do not have the right to organize and strike, not only in the time of war or in a crisis, but almost any time. And, in order to win back favor of this, we have Truman saying, no, I'm going to veto that. But his veto was even overdone through a 2/3 vote through Congress that has ultimately made it hard for union members to organize in this. And so it was a really tough time for these midterm elections. Everybody loved FDR. He passed. They're like wondering, is Truman the real deal? He talks tough. He stands up to the Russians. He does believe in strong military, but he also is losing favor amongst the union people and a lot of people within his own party. For instance, Henry Wallace, he's a Democrat, but he believes that Truman isn't doing enough to protect the rights of the minority and protect the rights of the poor working class. And so this is divided in the Democrat Party. We have a Southerner from the South, Strom Thurmond, a typical racist there, that says, we want to continue the South like we always have with our Jim Crow laws. And so they would call themselves the Dixiecrats there. This split the Democratic ticket between 3 people. And then you have the Republican Thomas Dewey, who had a strong voice, and many thought that he would win the election. But ultimately, Truman wins the election because there were enough union people, there were enough Southern Democrats, there were enough people who did not like the progressive ticket to saying, let's just, redistribute all the wealth rather than creating new jobs and opportunity within the factories we already have, namely the automotive industry, if you will. Truman gets and wins the presidency at hand. I'm going to talk about that, I think, here in this slide right here. You can see in 1944, when FDR wins his 4th term, folks, incredible that you can see how many the electoral votes that Roosevelt had. And there you have, in the farming belt, so to speak, is what the Republicans held in the middle. Well, Roosevelt dies, the golden boy dies, and then up comes, his vice president, Harry S. Truman. This imperial presidency kind of comes to an end, and what does that mean for him? Well, as he runs for office, the 22nd Amendment is passed, basically saying forever can a president only run 2 cycles or 2 terms. And as I discussed earlier, there were a lot of things taking place that divided the Democratic vote. But this divided Democratic vote still enabled him to have just enough to edge out Dewey during this time, because of his hardline stance against communism, his hardline stance of continuing to create a strong military, and his hardline stance against this idea of progressivism that was about redistribution of money rather than creating more jobs across America during that time. Well, that leads us to the second point here of the boom years and when things are expanding. Well, we begin seeing finally the inflation comes under control, the factories have become recalibrated. So, for instance, during this time, the automotive industry goes on a major growth point. In fact, I think by 1960, we have some 85% of the homes all having 1 car or more. Crazy amount of numbers. Well, that wouldn't have happened if those factories, didn't convert from making the tanks and the planes that they were doing to now making cars. But what does this do? Making of cars and those big ticket items like that helps elevate the pay for everybody working in those factories. And when you have, let's say, 19 different motor companies, from Buick to Ford to Chevy to Studebaker, there's tons of them during this time. All of them are providing work for hundreds of thousands of people, from the window maker to the rear view mirror to the tires, etc. This elevates the growing middle class. Just think about the logistics alone, how many office people were needed to make sure the orders were kept, fulfilling the orders, delivery of the cars, tons of mid-level management, etc. was going on. And so we see a major growth domestic product increase, almost 35% during this 15-year period. And what does this mean? We no longer having it where we have just the 1%ers at the top and the rest of the middle, like not even a middle class, but lower middle class and poor. We now see a middle class being much larger, and we actually seeing the wealthy shrinking during this time, where money is now more greatly distributed than what we've ever seen before. And this is a good thing. And here you can see the chart that where on the left-hand side, the red line, you see the GDP, or the G gross national product, is rising, rising, rising at the end of World War II. But what is interesting is the gap between how much people are making is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, and that's good news. You never want to go the other way around. You always want to keep those lines close enough together to where people can, as growth is happening, the same group of people can keep buying and getting consumer goods as we go along the way. Well, the boom year continues to also affect traditional gender roles. And if you remember, hundreds of thousands of women filled these jobs when the men had to go off to fight in World War II. Now that the war is over, those hundreds of thousands of soldiers are coming back. What happens to the women? They're being booted out of their job places and said, well, it's time for you to go back to your homes and take up the roles that you were expected to have during that time. What does this lead to? We see an increase in money, we have an increase of time and leisure, and we have an increase in doctors and better health care. And what does this refer to? More free time, more money, fuller bellies, less fertility death of children. We see a major boom of children being born. I would love to say it was because there was no television and that's what caused the parents, to get old. But no, there were plenty of TVs. In fact, I think there were close to 73% of the homes by 1960 that had a television in them as well. But why is this significant? Is that it again forces most women to have to shift again to go back and reassert the role that they had as that domestic helper or that Republican motherhood that we've been alluding to from the very beginning. We will see some gender roles changing, but by and large, for most women in America, they returned back to home and kind of to live out what that feminine ideal looked like. And we'll unpack that when we get to talk about Friedman and her seminal work here in a little bit. Here's the polio vaccine being given to these children. This is an important thing that Jonas Salk had invented, and I find it very interesting that we're talking about, you know, the same type of thing with the COVID, and you know, who's going to get the shots first and who's going to be fair to that. Can you imagine this caring concern that parents had, that which communities were going to get the shots first before others, and who's going to be in the front of the line, because polio was a very serious thing. And my grandfather had polio, and it locked him down, had to live in one of those iron lungs for months to stay alive. And by the time that it was all said and done, one leg was actually shorter than the other, and he had to walk around with a shoe that was about, one shoe had elevated aspects to it, so he didn't walk with a major limp back and forth on that. Well, let's talk about the changing of lifestyle and patterns in the home. I alluded to how because the boom and baby boom, in fact, some argue that America had grown so fast that we were beginning to rival the population rates of India at this time. Crazy amount of children being born. But why is this happening? We now have larger incomes, and because of that, there's an increased demand for better housing, and I will allude to that here in some subsequent slides. And what does this do? A major migration of people begin moving out. When I say major migration of people, predominantly white, Anglo-Saxon, middle-class people. Okay, how are they able to do this? Well, the government passes this thing called the FHA, and this FHA, Federal Housing Administration, essentially gives out loans at a low interest rate to enable them to afford a home where they otherwise couldn't. Now, why is this important? Well, if I have the home that I'm selling to you and I'm the home builder, knowing that you're using a government loan to buy my house, I have confidence to know that even if you walk away from the house, I'm still going to get paid. So having them backing that up was huge. Now, what even made it more incredible is that the GI Bill that we talked about at the beginning gave even a better deal for vets, where they didn't have to have a down payment, and they had lower interest rates to boot in. So that enabled them to really get into a home, which helped them to gain value and have, feel like they have a quality of life that would be better if they lived in apartments and had to rent and all of those things. One such person, William Levitt, took these ideas of mass production and brought them to the suburban areas. He went and bought these large potato fields outside of New Jersey, and there literally built 17,000 houses in one neighborhood, okay, and made it incredibly affordable for people to live. Why did he do this, and why did he was able to do it? Because all 17,000 people got loans from the government to go buy his places, so it wasn't that much of a risk. But it was a brilliant design that, yeah, he had to fork the money out on the front end of this stuff, and it gave tons of jobs and required all sorts of things. I mean, take a look at this picture here of these different home styles that people can choose based on how much money they can afford. And this caused people and allowed people to leave the downtowns of Jersey, downtown, the boroughs of New York City and Manhattan, and pursue elsewhere. Now, please note, this was a migration of white people. African Americans were exclusively forbidden. In fact, they had covenants, and I'll talk about this at some point here soon, that forbade African Americans from buying or from white people to sell to them. You couldn't sell to Jews, you couldn't sell to Asian, you couldn't sell to Mexican. Crazy, they had laws that prevented this type of thing. And so as you see white people fleeing the major cities, who was replacing them? Well, people, Southern blacks coming in, the Puerto Ricans were coming in to take over those areas there. So in a nutshell, for Middle America, for the WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, this time after the war was great. Again, the legacy, the ugly black eye of America continues, where there is disparity and inequality to the African Americans. Even if they could afford to buy a home, they were being forbidden from doing such a thing. So here's a restricted covenant that I'll talk about with my Steger Select. Well, where and why did people want to migrate? Well, it's pretty simple. You know, in California, we wear flip-flops mostly all winter long. You can't be doing that when you're in the snow belt throughout the year. And so we discovered that most people migrated because these new communities were being built, just like Mr. Levitt was doing, to create new opportunities. So Florida begins taking over. We have Texas begins taking over. We have California growing by some 6 million people during this time. And what's the reason? Well, there's jobs in those areas, but the weather's better, and this invention of air conditioning, holla, makes living in Arizona seem somewhat feasible and somewhat plausible. So to reiterate and to conclude here, we need to recognize that there just wasn't one big theme taking place post-World War II, but America during this time was undergoing drastic changes for the middle class in terms of economic. But at the same time, you see marginalized peoples not able to have access to those things that most white Anglo-Saxon people might have. So in that, keep it classy, Golden Bears, and we'll see you until next time.